Hey, what's up guys? John from Mongo Fishing. Talk to you guys about swim jigs. So let's get into it. So what makes a swim jig a little different than other jigs? All right. So first off, typically you have a pointy head, right? The nose is pointy. It's hydrodynamic, right? It's meant to cut through the water pretty easy, cut through grass and etc. Pretty easy, not get hung up on stuff very much. Because you're swimming it, right? You want it to be able to move through stuff. Some of them are pointy like that. Others have like flat chin so that it gets a little bit of lift and stays up. Again, because you're trying to swim this jig, you don't need to drag it across the bottom. You want it to be able to swim pretty easy. So that's kind of what makes a swim jig is the head shape, okay? So, you know, they have different thicknesses, brush guards. You know, typically when I'm throwing one, if I'm throwing like around a lot of like heavy vegetation or something where it's really sticky, where I'm going to get hung up a lot, then I like a stiff weed guard. If I'm doing it in softer vegetation, sparse vegetation, stuff like that, then a soft weed guard's perfectly fine for me. So that'll be something you'll just need to play around with and find out what you prefer. I throw a swim jig pretty much from like late spring all the way through the beginning of the fall. You know, like pre-spawn through the fall is a good time to throw a swim jig. Where I throw it, you know, I kind of touched on that a little bit. Submerged vegetation, emerged vegetation like water willow, stuff like that, lily pads, laydowns, buckbrush, docks, seawalls, wherever, anywhere that is basically shallow water, right? It's a shallow water technique. It's for burning down the bank. Now you can also throw it if you have like a offshore flat, you know, offshore grass flat, that works fine too. But again, it's not really a deep water technique. There are better techniques for deep water fishing. But shallow water, you want to cover a bunch of ground. This is a great technique. All right, so rod, reel, line, all that fun stuff, and colors. All right, let's get into that. So back to when to use it. If I'm fishing during the shad spawn, 100% of the time I'm starting with a shad color, a white and chartreuse, something that represents a shad or a minnow of some sort. If I'm around the bluegill spawn, then I'm probably going with a black and blue or a green pumpkin, some sort of natural color like a green pumpkin. Those are pretty much the only three colors that I really throw. Trailers, you know, it's up to your imagination, but there's pretty much four that I use almost, you know, all the time. You have a swim bait, like a Kitech, or in this case, this is a Strike King Rage Swimmer. A cross style trailer. This is a Rage Cross. I typically like to use these, not necessarily this color, but I typically like to use these in like heavy, really thick stuff where I'm putting out a bunch of ruckus, a bunch of you know, like it's a larger profile, it's gonna kick a little more, so like thick pads, dirtier water, stuff like that is where I like to use this. A Strike King Structure Bug. I like to rig this horizontally like that as the trailer. What that does is it allows it, because it's so fat, it allows it to sink a little slower. So especially if I'm in shallow water, you know, like the 1 to 2 foot sort of depth, this keeps it in the strike zone a little longer, so it doesn't, you know, sink down as fast. I can work it through water willow a little easier, stuff like that. So Strike King Structure Bug. And then my number one trailer that I use the most, more than any of them, is the Strike King Rage Menace. And the reason I use the Menace so much, one, it's a little smaller profile. So it's almost like I'm finesse fishing a swim jig. I can go with a little smaller swim jig. I can go with a little smaller profile. Doesn't kick as much, but still puts out a little bit of thump. You can fish it horizontally, so these little things are kicking like this, or you can fish it vertically, so these little things are kicking sideways like a little minnow swimming. So that's why I prefer this one the most. is because I can rig it multiple ways. This is my go-to, but those other three trailers do get used quite a bit. Again, it's all depending on where I'm fishing, what I'm trying to do with my swim jig. All right, so how to swim jig? Well, let's get into some footage. All right, guys, I have thrown the shad color for about 10 minutes. So now I'm gonna go with a black and blue, because the only thing I've seen so far, I've seen a handful of bluegill. So let's see if these, I haven't seen any shad. So let's see if I can get bit on a black and blue through this water willow, because maybe these bass are feeding on bluegill. I'll do this for 10 minutes. If I don't get any bites, then I will switch probably back to the shad. There we go. Switch up colors and catch a fish. Like that, guys. It was 1:50 seconds. Got to pay attention to what's going on. Like I said, I had thrown that shad pattern for a little over 10 minutes with no bites, and the only thing I saw was bluegill swimming around. Switch up to a bluegill color and catch a fish almost immediately. So guys, it's just a matter of paying attention to your environment, watching your environmental conditions, and see what's like, paying attention to what's actually happening. Not what you want to happen, but what's actually happening. Like, I wanted to catch them on the shad color. It's just my favorite color to throw. But after seeing that there was no shad anywhere around, so I went to bluegill, or black and blue. I figured these bass have to be feeding on bluegill then. There we go. Nine minutes. So now I'm pretty confident that bluegill is what I need to be throwing. 10 minutes with nothing on one color. Switch colors. 9 minutes, I catch two. There we go. There you go. All right, guys, let's talk how to use the swim jig. So, like, especially in things like water willow, lily pads, stuff like that, fishing a swim jig is a lot like taking a selfie for Instagram. It's all about the angles. You know, like right now I just made a, you know, a kind of long cast to work down that little outside edge right there. But when I pull up on a little, you know, an edge of a smaller little pocket, then I'll just kind of flip in there and hit that. So it's all about the angles. You might have to hit it a few different directions. This little cut right here, for example, you know, I'll go down the outside edge first. There's all sorts of little cuts right here. Once you start figuring out how the fish are that day, whether they're on inside edges or outside edges or you know, in those little cuts right there or however, then you can start eliminating some water. Maybe work through some of those, like if they're on outside edges, maybe you don't spend as much time flipping those little tiny pockets. You still want to flip them occasionally, but you know, you want to spend the majority of your time out here on the outside edge instead. So how to work it. You notice I'm bouncing my rod, kind of feathering it through that grass. Occasionally I'll pulse it down like that. That's just a personal preference of mine. Really depends on how I want to work the swim jig. A lot of guys just do this up and down feathering. And that's pretty much the only way they'll work it. But I like to switch it up. Sometimes I'll do that. Sometimes I'll do this. And it does make a difference on how the swim jig is swimming. And if you got a good trailer, technically you don't need to do anything. You can cast it out and reel it back if you want. Let your trailer do all the motion and movements, but this little shake does impart some more action on your swim jig. And I feel it gets more bites. That's a nice one. It's a 2-pounder. "16-incher. It's like I was saying about angles a little bit ago. You know, I kind of threw that one backwards to hit that little angle right this way, to fish down through that. I had been working up through this and then through a cast behind me, because again, it's all about those angles. Rod, reel, and line. I don't know why. I guess I need to get on a soapbox real fast. There's so much false information put out on YouTube, and it kind of bothers me, but you can look this up. You guys don't have to believe me. You can verify it through literally every line company out there. Fluorocarbon has better abrasion resistance than monofilament. So when I'm using this, since I'm throwing it around stuff that can cause abrasion, I'm throwing it on either 15 to 20 pound fluoro, or I'm throwing it on braid. If I'm throwing it on fluoro, we'll start there. Me personally, 15 to 20 pound fluoro. This happens to be Ozuri fluoro. I have it on a Denali Kovert 7'2" medium heavy fast action. This is my #1 swim jig rod. On a basic, Lew's American Hero series rod, or sorry, reel. I think it's like a 7-to-1 gear ratio. And then my other rod that I like to use is also a Denali Kovert 7'2". This one's a heavy fast. This one is the one I typically use with braid because, I want that heavy. If I'm throwing with braid, that means I'm probably throwing it in something really nasty. And so I have the nastier stuff on a stouter rod with the stouter line, etc. So that's that. Now, one thing about color that I mentioned, or that I said I almost always start with the shad during the shad spawn and the bluegill during bluegill spawn. You also need to pay attention to what's going on in your surroundings. If you're throwing a shad pattern and you're not seeing any shad anywhere, but you're seeing bluegill, then switch up to the bluegill pattern. Or vice versa. If you're throwing a bluegill pattern because you think they're eating bluegill and you're not seeing any bluegill anywhere, but you're seeing other little minnows and shad and stuff like that, then switch to a shad pattern. Throw what you think the fish are actively feeding on, and you'd be surprised. It may change the outcome of your day. Anyway, guys, thank you very much for watching. If you're new to the channel, again, please hit the subscribe button right down there along with the bell notification button. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them down below. If you enjoyed the video and learned something, please give it a thumbs up. And again, drop a comment below.